do need to be careful when you pray and ask God for a vision of what it's to be. Because then you have to figure out how to work Scotch tape or masking tape, and that gets complicated. But I want to say thank you, first of all, before we started, to my lovely assistant. She's better than Vanna. She is my wife, Heather. And she came a long way. She's sacrificing a great deal by saying yes to God. She said no to a day at the spa and the golf course with her mother to be here with me. And I'm really grateful she's here, because the Lord gave us a vision, gave me a vision for talking about some mess. And it involved finger paints. And the goal was for me to paint and talk at the same time. And I realized very quickly, after practice time, that that wasn't going to happen very well. And so Heather, God bless her, she bailed me out again and came by and said, let me help you. So she's going to do some paint. And we're going to do what God's called us to do together today. It's great to be with you in this time. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but we're going to try this anyway. We're going to make a mess. And mission, the reality is that mission is messy. Have you ever noticed that when God calls you to put your hands on what He is endeavoring you to do, whether it's in your life or in your church, that there's usually some mess involved? We'd like it if it was linear. We'd like it if, when we were on mission, and if it just went in a line. And we get together with our teams and we pray and we plan and we dream together about mission. And we go, and we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. Oh, and then this is going to happen, and we've got a beautiful line that we believe we're going to go on mission. And then God shows up. And we start working with people who have real needs. And people who are desperate, people who are broken, and people who need what God has to offer. And it's never neat. And I don't know how many of you have been surprised by that along the way. There's always more than you expected when you're on mission with God. We've been learning that in our church all the way back across eastern Pennsylvania, a little place called Lancaster, a place called Providence Church. The last couple of years, we began following God into a journey that involved starting a Celebrate Recovery group in our community for people with hurts and hang-ups and habits. And the support group we thought we were starting for those folks became so much more. And it's as if a Monday night church is breaking out downstairs. Every Monday evening, about 30, 40, sometimes up to 50 people with a lot of tattoos and some piercings and cigarette habits can be caught out in front of the church having a break together. And it's interesting how God's birthed this thing, because in the beginning when they come in for supper, and it goes great, we're sitting around the table with each other, and then we do a little worship time together, and at first it was everyone just sitting there staring at the screen. Because vast majority of these folks never enter a church building anywhere or get that close to God that they even know what worship is. And so it's taken a couple of years, but recently people are getting up out of chairs and they're going in the back, even standing, and they're even singing. And even when the screen doesn't always match up with the words, they know some of these words now because they've been singing them for a year and a half. They started sharing prayer requests with each other publicly. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal when some of these folks have been in and out of prison, in and out of rehab centers, and they're starting to get comfortable enough and feel accepted enough to share their prayer requests with each other. They're also sharing more than prayer requests. We found out along the way, speaking of the mess, they will times share their prescription pills with each other. And so we have to get a little messy as we deal with that. And then, of course, as I said, the smoke break is a regular part of Monday night church. And one Tuesday morning, one of our pastors a year and a half ago was walking up around the corner of the church, and the corner of the mulch bed was smoldering. And I hear one of the butts didn't quite get rubbed out enough, and so thank God we get the hose. I think Chuck got the hose out, started watering down the mulch, so we didn't have a building fire on our hands. There's a lot of things that happen when you get on mission. The mess can be beautiful. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of the women who's been helping with us since the beginning of our ministry together shared her testimony. And she shared a lot of pain from her childhood and the deep wounds of being molested by a stepfather after her parents had been divorced. And she was sharing through a lot of tears that night. And while she was crying and while she was trying to talk, one of the guys in the group got up with a box of tissues and came to the front and brought her a box of tissues. A few minutes later, she's crying again about something that she's sharing. And a little girl who came that night for dinner with her grandmother came up and brought her a cup of water. I want to give Carrie a cup of water, you could hear her say. And so she came up and brought a cup of water. Eventually, as Carrie shared through her hurts and all the things that happened in her life, she eventually landed on something that happened a couple of years ago. She was caught embezzling some money from her employer. And it was several $1,000s, and she lost her job. Thankfully, the company allowed her to make restitution, allowed her to pay court costs, and then do some community service to work off her debt. But one of the most difficult things that Carrie had to deal with on that journey was she didn't want to disappoint her father. It took a long time for her to be able to tell her family about this, and her dad specifically, who's now in his 70s, mid-70s, late 70s. And so she finally broke through, prayed about it, was able to tell her dad, and he came a couple weeks ago to see her when she was sharing her testimony that night. She finally broke through, and at the end, as the tears were flowing and she was trying to catch her breath through the tears, there was this pause as everyone waited, and then her dad broke the silence with the words that had all of us going for the tissues. He said, "I love you, baby. I love you." And as she finished, a few minutes later, he was the first one up out of the seat to go and join the hug line for Carrie. You know when you're in those places, when your hands are getting messy, but the beauty of God and the truth of God is breaking all around you, and you can sense it. It's a holy place when God breaks into the mess and people's lives that are messy. But you see something of the beauty of God just emerge from that. What enables us to get messy? Because mission is messy. What enables us, and I've been praying about that, thinking about to stay on mission for the long haul of our lives. And something that Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 speaks to it so well. He said, "What? For the love of Christ compels us." For the love of Christ compels us because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. The New American Standard, I think, says that the love of Christ controls us. And so the reality is we're getting messy. And as God's working and moving and bringing about His beauty in people's lives, what is it that's going to enable us to stay messy for the long haul? It's the love of Christ compels us. I can't get around it. I can't. I don't know how else we do it. I don't know how else we can stay messy with people unless there's some source. Because he goes on to talk later on in that end of that chapter about this great ministry of reconciliation, that we are ambassadors for Christ. And we love that. That's a big part of our missionary focus. And when we have weekends and talk about mission, we talk about this ministry of reconciliation and rescue that God is all about. And the reality is we want to be ambassadors, but there's a deeper root. The deeper root is back in the 14th verse. For the love of Christ compels us, because we're convinced that He died for all, and that we should no longer live for ourselves. So love enables us to get messy. Loving people with deep needs, loving people who are hard to love, loving people we disagree with. Jesus specialized in that. You don't have to read the Gospels very long or very hard to see how Jesus just poured out with people all around. We're messy. I think about finger paints, and I think about Jesus in John 8 and scribbling in the sand, scribbling in the dirt, as that woman is before him, broken, messy. And he poured out his grace and he poured out his love, and they dropped their stones, and she was restored. She was made whole by his love. I wonder what compels Andrew Draper and his family. Andrew's down this afternoon, to move into downtown Muncie and be a part of the transformation of that city with Urban Light. I wonder. God's Spirit whispers to me, for the love of Christ compels us. I wonder what it is that moved Derek Gates into the city of Kansas City to reach some people who live on the edge. People who in a lot of our churches wouldn't feel real comfortable, but as God has moved, as Christ's love has compelled Derek into that part of Kansas City to see that kind of resurrection happen in people's lives. It's that whispered phrase again, for the love of Christ compels us. I wonder what it is that allows the church, one of our churches, that has a pretty high-ranking grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan who's worshiping regularly in their church, exploring the claims of Jesus Christ, trying to sort out what life means, what his racism means, what God's plan is as he engages in worship. I wonder what compels Brian Miller and the folks at Crossover as they work with people in the margins. I understand that a couple of years ago they gave a scholarship for a local community college to an at-risk high school graduate. And the first year they gave it away, the girl cashed the check in and put the cash in her trunk, because that was the safest place she knew to put that much money in her trunk. I know that the folks in the Southwest who are working out with our friends in Arizona and New Mexico, John and Tony and others, who have consistently had to love people who are messy and broken and love them into the church, to see them stumble and fall and maybe get back on the bottle, and then we start over again and we start over again, and we keep loving and keep pouring out the love of Christ. I even understand at the General Conference office that because it has the word church painted all over, there's people who stop by there on a regular basis looking for help. And for the past 3 or 4 months, Lance has been saying that there's been a few of them in the office working with a particular homeless individual who was a felon and a sex offender. He's been stopping by. It's messy, it's not convenient, it's not on schedule, and you struggle with the balance between actually helping and enabling. But it opens the door for a lot of people who are falling through the cracks. I want to say this to you today. Passion is a great fuel. We talk a lot about passion and living out of passion. And I want to be passionate about the things of God and extending his kingdom. But I want to say this to you. Passion has a tendency to leak. Did you ever notice that? Sometimes when I'm sharing in weddings and in marriages and working with couples, I'll talk about that. Passion has a tendency to leak. Love never fails, the scripture says. Love is steadfast. Love is faithful. Love is long-suffering. Love is committed. Love endures through all kinds of seasons. So even when you're not passionate, there'll be seasons when you're not. The love of Christ compels us still. Even when you can't conjure it up. When your well is dry, it is what? The love of Christ that compels us to stay in the court, to stay the course, to stay messy. Another thing that love does is it moves us out and draws us in. We've been talking the last number of years as I've been worked with Lawrence for a number of years at Providence, New Providence before his called Chambersburg, and we talked a lot about building bridges. And what does it mean to build bridges? Because when we build bridges into our communities, it moves us out and it draws people in. There's a two-way thing that happens, and Heather's going to work on the bridge, but there's movement on the bridge. I want to say this about that. Sometimes we have to be very careful about this and check ourselves and our motives, because sometimes ambition will move us out on the bridge, but it never draws people to us. Ambition will move us across to meet, but it will very rarely, if ever, draw people to us. Only the love of Christ draws people, because He's the one. He's the magnet. He's the irresistible force. He's the prime mover of the hearts of men and women. And so I was even thinking about that when I was back in high school in our community. I went for a couple of days to a Soul Winners Conference. And we spent the morning learning about the 4 spiritual laws and little books and the questions you ask. And then we got on the phone around lunchtime and made some phone calls in the community. And the afternoon was all about going out and knocking on doors and meeting people and confronting them with their sin and their need for Christ. I wonder about how God is called. Are we hitting the streets to confront people? Or are we hitting the streets to bless them? Are we doing that? Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. The promise begins, right? And Abraham is called, and through him the blessing is going to roll down through the ages and still rolls. And it's called to bless the nations through us. And so there's something about serving people that is amazing. As we meet them on the bridge and begin to serve practical needs, there's something about the love of Christ that draws them into Himself as their needs and His love meet together. I think tomorrow afternoon, a lot of you are going to get, maybe all of you will get the opportunity as part of this conference. I'm so thrilled that you're going to be able to do this, be able to get onto the streets around Findlay and start to just serve people and bless people. And there's something about doing some yard work for people, or having a landscape day, or doing some painting on someone's house in terms of building those bridges. It draws them into the marvelous love of Jesus. Because love helps people see that they're not the project. They're not the project. They're not the project. Vital. We've been building some bridges. I mentioned Celebrate Recovery, and we have a second campus that God led us to start almost 2 years ago in town, about 11 miles away from New Providence, in a place called Lampeter, where we live. And God's been moving and stirring and raising up a group there in Lampeter. We also, as we met with the school district a few years ago, started talking about how can we bless people in this community that we live in? How can we build bridges together? And the superintendent said, we started talking about some ideas about strengthening families. And so we have a partnership that actually Heather helps with in terms of this thing called Strengthening Families. There's actually some stuff that was developed at Iowa State University, in a secular institution, but written by a pastor's wife. As this common wisdom of how we get next to families and help them through their kids through temptation, peer pressure, how do we communicate better, how do we build a team together. So for 7 weeks we get together with kids in the local high school, and there's a meal, and then there's family time. The kids go into one place, the parents go in another place, they have separate time. Then they come together for the 3rd hour and have a family time and share and bless each other. And there's something powerful about strengthening families. It's happening family by family by family as we build bridges together. So love does that. And love causes us, I'll say this finally, love causes us to risk. I don't know if the bridge is done, but love causes us to risk. And the reality is that doing church in the bubble is safe. I've been thinking a lot about this. Church in the bubble. You know, we know how to do VBS. We know how to put together worship services. We know how to do choir practice. We know how to do Sunday school. We know how to do Bible study. We know how to make hospital visits. But love moves us out of the bubble, and we start to ask questions we don't have the answers to. That's huge. What kind of questions are we asking? I was at a breakfast in the early part of June in our community, and sitting at a table next to me was the chief of police of our town, and across the table was a judge in the city of Lancaster who deals in family court. And then across from him was the district justice who writes up a lot of citations in our community. He deals with a lot of families. Some counselors around that table. The superintendent of schools was there again. And we were having this breakfast together, beginning talking, asking questions about our community. And the superintendent of schools says, I need help. We need help with dealing with truancy in our schools. We've got a big problem. How are we going to deal with truancy? And so now our whole table is starting to engage around how are we going to help kids and families connect together so that school becomes a priority, so that getting to school together. And so there's something about that conversation, and I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know yet. God certainly has something master planned out. We're gathering back together in the month, I think in September, to talk again and have another conversation, ask more questions. What kind of questions are we asking? In our communities, in your towns, you're asking, I pray that you're asking questions. What about homelessness in our area? What about illiteracy? What are we doing about that? What about kids who are going hungry over the weekends? What about drug use in our schools, in our communities? What kind of questions are you asking? What kind of questions is your church asking? Because love moves us out of the bubble. It's safe in the bubble. And there's something about this whole thing. And I know some of you have done some reading of John Eldridge over the years. He's written a lot of good stuff. And he talks a lot about this rescue operation that we're all on together. That God's doing this thing, and it's an epic, as he calls it. And that you and I have a heroic role to play. And that gets me out of bed in the morning. Even when the passion's leaking, it gets me out of bed in the morning. To know that there's something God's doing that day in my town, in our community, that I get to be a part of. I get to get my hands on and see what he does. Something about that that's engaging to our souls. This cosmic battle between good and evil that's being waged around us. And we are, a lot of times, just playing a church in the bubble. Man, he wants us to get our hands messy. Get us out. Start taking risks. I hope this gives you a little bit of picture of what the Lord just birthed in our hearts as we begin to think about what it means to be on mission together. The love of Christ compels us.